Hey guys, I'm out for a hike with my daughter and I thought I would talk to you today about trail etiquette and some of the things that I abide by, some of the things that I think might be helpful for you to know if you are looking to get started in trail riding. Things might be different where you are, so I encourage you guys to leave a comment down below, any tips, any etiquette stuff that you like to follow when you are out on the trail. So let's get going. One safety thing that I really like to do, especially when I am going around blind corners, is I like to call ahead. I like to yell ahead horses when I know that the trail is busy, because very often these days I find there's more and more users of the trail that are listening to music, which, you know, at that point, if you're really yelling, they may not hear you anyway. But as a courtesy on blind corners, I definitely like to call ahead, and I make it a point to not lope or trot around blind corners, just because you never know who you're going to encounter. And again, very commonly in my area, we have a lot of cyclists. And the last thing I want is a head-on collision, so I always slow down when I go around blind corners. And then if I'm going to go faster than a walk, I will do that when I can see pretty clearly ahead. It's not nothing, you guys. That's one thing, hiking makes you respect your horse and the amount of work that your horse has to go through to carry your butt uphill. I also make sure that I stick to my side of the trail. Of course, depending on how wide the trail is, that may or may not be possible. There may not be a side if it's just a single track trail. But for like the wider fire road trails, I always make sure that I'm staying on my side, with some exceptions. If it's a very steep drop off, I will hug the mountain for safety purposes. And then I am very adamantly being vocal in case anyone might accidentally, you know, come around a corner. I always make sure that I close the gates that I open. We have a lot of parks in our area where cattle graze and it's shared land, and the last thing you want is for the cows to get out, right? So I always make sure that I close the gates if the gate was closed to begin with. There are some instances where they're moving the cattle different places and they prop the gate open and they let you know, like, leave the gate open. But for the most part, close the gates that you open, make sure they are latched, and then don't walk across cattle grate. I mentioned this in one of my other videos where I show a cattle grate that's there, and those basically exist so that the cows don't walk across them. They're scared of them and they avoid them, and it's kind of a deterrent without actually having a fence and a gate. But it is dangerous for your horse. You don't want your horse to step on that. They can break a leg. Worst case scenario, you could end up losing your horse. So it's just not a safe thing. So make sure you don't walk across those if you have them in your area. Super important to stay on the designated trails for conservation reasons, to protect the trails, and also for yourself and for your horse. The times that I have gone off trail, and actually technically I wasn't off trail, the trail hadn't been cleared due to the pandemic, so we were reblazing the trail, but I was picking so many ticks out of Fame's feathers, and it was an absolute nightmare. So there's good reasons to stay on the trail. In our area, we get a lot of poison oak, ticks, as I mentioned, and sometimes there's just gopher holes and things. So it's good etiquette, good protocol to protect the trails and actually stay on the trails. Also good etiquette for protecting the trails to avoid mud. Your horse probably doesn't want to walk in the mud anyway, but it can actually contribute to erosion of the trails, and you can end up leaving some pretty severe divots in the trail once that mud dries up that can be damaging over time to the trail if multiple people are doing that over and over and over again, and it can lead to trail erosion, and it creates an unsmooth surface that sometimes they will have to go through and like regrade the trails, I guess, in certain areas. So, you know, avoid the mud puddles, right? In case you aren't doing that already. And speaking of mud, I am very conscientious about making sure I call ahead if there's been rain to find out if the trails are in fact open. So the parks in my area will sometimes close after heavy rains to protect the trail. They will close them usually to cyclists and equestrians. So for example, I'm in Santa Clara County. Our parks department has a hotline that you can call, and you can press a button depending on the park to find out if the park is open that day for riding. Pack your trash, don't litter, be respectful of noise. There's more and more users in my area that are doing their hikes and rides with music, which honestly, that's not really so much an issue with equestrians. I find that happens more with hikers and cyclists. But I know for myself, I come out here to listen to the birds and to experience the sounds of nature. I don't want to hear Bruno Mars. I love Bruno Mars. I love Bruno Mars, but I don't want to hear Bruno Mars on the trail. I also make sure that I check the park map if I haven't been there before. And actually, I tend to extensively plan my rides if I've never been to a park before. I have a video on how I use all trails to plan out my rides that I will link down in the description below. But basically, I want to check and make sure that I'm on trails that are allowed for equestrians. There are some trails in my area that are hikers only, and so I try to make sure that I'm obviously not on those trails. And usually if it's labeled hikers only, there's a good reason for it. It's not because, you know, they're trying to rob us of good trails. It's usually because like the tree branches are way too low and dangerous for equestrians, or there's like really narrow single track that isn't suitable for a horse, steep drop-offs, really super rocky terrain, steps, that kind of stuff. So I always check the maps to make sure I'm sticking to equestrian designated trails. And I make sure that if he's pooped in the parking lot, in the equestrian parking lot, that I clean that up. And any excess hay too. Obviously you can't get like every single tiny little bit of hay, but if there's excess hay and poop, I will scoop all that up and throw it in my trailer and muck out my trailer when we get home. I do not muck out my trailer at the parks. I think that's rude, and there's a lot of signs that indicate not to do that, so I don't. Isn't this beautiful? Oh my gosh. I love this area so much. I can't wait to get out here with Fame and ride. So when it comes to encountering other equestrians on the trail, usually, you know, it's just we're passing each other. Hi, have a good ride, nice to see you, that kind of thing. But sometimes if we're like a large group or they're a large group, you know, there's just some instances where I try to check and say, hey, is it okay if we pass you guys? Maybe they're stopped for some reason, and you know, sometimes someone has had to dismount for whatever reason, or maybe someone's come off. Hopefully no one's come off, but if someone had to dismount, let's say I approach a group and they're all stopped, I will ask, hey, is it okay if I pass you guys? Because sometimes what can happen is that person's trying to get on, and if you're walking past them as they're trying to get on and their horse is like, hey, where are you going? I'm gonna follow that guy. It can be hard for them to get on. So I always just kind of check with the group, like, hey, is it okay if I pass you guys? And usually they're like, yeah, and they wave me by. And I do keep my pace at a walk. I don't want to trot by people because, again, that can be triggering for their horse. And, you know, everyone is responsible for their own horse, but I think as equestrians, we do want to look out for each other and recognize that our horses can be triggered or spooked or bothered by things. And I never want to put anyone in an unsafe position. And so, yeah, I will make sure that my horse is slowed to a walk before I pass anybody too. I'm going to do a separate video talking about riding in groups and just general group etiquette when you're riding with other riders. So one of the most important things is interacting with other users of the trail. And I always do my best to be courteous and respectful. And I find that a lot of people don't know how to interact with horses. They don't know how to be around horses. And so part of my job as the rider is to guide people and appreciate people in terms of interacting with my horse. So in my area, we have very clear signs indicating right-of-way, and equestrians always have the right-of-way over cyclists and over hikers. Not everyone is aware of this sign, and not everyone is aware of this etiquette, and so sometimes I do have to make requests of folks and ask that they step aside if I need them to step aside for any reason. I also make a point to let people know that I'm behind them, because as an equestrian, I'm definitely faster than all the hikers on the trail, so we pass a lot of hikers. And sometimes people are engaged in conversation and they don't hear you coming. And so I will let them know, hey, you know, coming up on your left. And most of the time, hikers will stop. They will step aside, I think partly for their own self-preservation, to give you space, and then they let us pass, and it's a pleasant exchange. Sometimes in tight spaces, I will, depending on safety, like I don't want anyone stepping into poison oak or something just to let us pass. So there have been a few rare occasions where I will tell people, you know, go ahead on up to that next clearing, and I'll stay, you know, far behind you, and then we'll pass you at that point. But usually there's plenty of room on the trail for us to just pass by. Sometimes I've had to make requests of people if they, like there was a little kid, you know, flailing a big stick that was making Fame nervous one time, and I had to ask them, you know, could you please put the stick down until we were past? But for the most part, it's a non-issue. People generally are excited to see a horse. With cyclists, sometimes my experiences are positive and sometimes not so much. I think technically in my area, cyclists are supposed to stop and dismount to let equestrians pass, but I think that's happened once, at least the dismounting part. A lot of times they will stop though. But for me, really, I just ask that they slow down, because sometimes the shifting of the gears, that sound can be unnerving sometimes for horses, but mostly it's just the speed, especially if they're not expected and they blow right by you. That can be really upsetting for a horse. Hi. So anytime I pass a cyclist and they've made a point to slow down, I make a big deal. I say, thank you so much. I really appreciate you slowing down. I hope you have a wonderful ride, and just try to appreciate that courtesy, because I get it. If you're a cyclist, you're having a good time. It's probably kind of a downer to have to slow down and stop for an equestrian. Particularly on the downhill, I know that they work really hard to go uphill, and then they want to enjoy their downhill. But that's oftentimes too when it can be the most dangerous, is if they're picking up a lot of speed. So a lot of times a cyclist is too far away to really hear me if I'm asking them to slow down, if they're not slowing down and I know it's going to be a problem. So I will use this visual cue to kind of, which I think is universal, like, hey, slow down. There was one time, I don't recommend doing this, there was one time I was super frustrated with a guy that just wasn't slowing down. I don't think he understood at all. So I actually stood in the middle of the trail with my horse. I parked him perpendicular across the trail. And then he realized, oh, I'm supposed to slow down, and skidded to a halt. And I was like, thank you so much. I really appreciate you slowing down. And thankfully, Fame was okay with it. But again, that's not something I would recommend doing. I was a little bit frustrated. When it comes to interacting with hikers with dogs, I mean, honestly, this could be its own video, but I, will ask them, hey, is it okay for me to pass you? Is your dog comfortable with horses? And honestly, I pay more attention to what the dog is doing than anything that the owner says. But I will ask that they, have a short leash if they don't already. Sometimes owners will grab their dog's collar, but either way, I just check to make sure that they've got But either way, I will just make sure that they've got a grip on their dog, and then I will give them wide berth as they pass. And I find that passing quickly and not stopping to do a whole lot of chit chat is the most effective. So that's the etiquette that I follow on trail. If I think of something else, I'll leave it in the comments. But I would love to hear from you guys down in the comments, what types of etiquette or tips you guys follow for the trails in your area. And if you have any questions that I can answer, definitely leave me a comment below. And if you're interested in a follow-up video on what I've done with dogs or anything else, let me know that too. Happy trails, you guys. Thanks for watching.